There. So we're all good to go, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Welcome, everyone. This is the session about ONAP streamlined release process, and I'll try to get into presentation mode. There we go. And here we have the usual antitrust policy notice. The agenda here is it's a workshop on the ONAP release process, including connection to use cases and requirements. And we have an hour now, and then after the break, we have another hour. So the idea is that part one would be observations and analysis, leading to hopefully a discussion. So I have a couple of slides where I sort of bring in feedback from my users that we have gotten in the TSC. And then I will also talk about an alternative ONAP release paradigm. And in part two, I was hoping we could review the present release process from the perspective of both alternatives, but the one that we're running now and this alternative. And I can't see, I hope David McBride is online and can help with the going through the table and the release process. Thanks. And please sort of shout out or interrupt at any time you want during the presentation. So we heard from China Mobile ONAP takeaways. So I copied a few slides here. The Ke Guang presented this to the ONAP TC, and he said he talked to the network orchestration team in China Mobile, and they're doing development based on El Alto release, and they are using some modules, and they're enhancing modules coming from ONAP. Let me see if I can get the no. I was hoping I could get the pointer. It doesn't really allow me to get a pointer. Sorry about that. I'll go on. So my point here is that I'm going to the next slide. If the computer allows me to do that, is that Cone is release 11, but El Alto is release 5. So it's a long way to go to update from El Alto to Cone, and also we see that there is evidence of forking of the modules or the components in ONAP. Moving over to the key takeaways and feedback from Bell Canada that was presented also to the TSC. This is the way that Bell Canada uses ONAP. There's an infrastructure, there are selected ONAP components, and third-party products and in-house development. I think this resembles how Ericsson also is using ONAP. It doesn't look quite like this because, of course, we have much more in-house development in our products, but we also have third-party products. This is sort of commercial products that we include, but also ONAP components and other open source components. Or we don't use the ONAP platform at all, and we try to upstream every changes that we make to the ONAP components that we are in charge of and that we're using. I think that's sort of, yeah, that's a feedback from Bell Canada. It also applies to us as a vendor. And then there are other sort of feedback here on the areas of improvement. It takes a lot of work to make ONAP work. Yeah, so onboard developers, leverage ONAP components and platform, and training materials and documentation are not sufficient. There's also upstream contributions specifically for them, yeah, and PTL is sort of working a lot with upstreaming contributions. My point here is that what Ram here is pointing to is at the lack of agility in ONAP makes it sort of difficult to work with. And the maintainability of ONAP components upstream is high and demanding, leading to downstream branches in companies, as we saw from mobile, China Mobile as well. And then you could sort of reflect on this. The life cycle management is not well thought of when it comes to upgradability. I think that we also see that feedback from many, that it's not possible to sort of upgrade seamlessly between different ONAP releases. Database migration and connection to database is also, we've also heard from several others. But then you can ask yourself, is this sort of reasonable requirements from an open source community? And I'll come back to that. And then, yeah, Ram also presented the user friendliness, visibility, flexibility of the components, and showing that, also saying that the components are tightly coupled to each other, that allow very less flexibility, and so on. And then on the other hand, he says, okay, well, you continue to use ONAP when you're pointing to all these sort of problems that you have. Yeah. But there are some expectations from the community on ONAP to become more modular and flexible, to provide operational and production-ready components, to interface with ORAN and helping solving the puzzle, interface with Nephew, and trim down the overheads and processes. So that's a clear sort of message to us. Moving on here, we also got a feedback from NSA Research, and that was sort of deployment and operations challenges. So breakdown of infrastructure, deployment, development, use guides, but still, yeah, it's helpful, but still needs work. And if infrastructure challenges, Kubernetes cluster sizing guidance. And then you can also think here about the expectations. Is this really what you would expect, sort of, if you have a platform and you want to use it, you would like to know sort of how you size the Kubernetes cluster. But from an open source point of view, I wonder, is this a reasonable requirement? And moving on, yeah, and also this, again, the Kubernetes cluster deployment size. There's also optimal worker node memory to CPU ratios, and so on. So it's very much what you would sort of struggle with when you put everything together. And if you have the expectations on ONAP to be able to give you a ready-made solution, a platform with all this, it's troublesome. Okay, so moving on here, this is the latest architecture for the London release, and you've seen here that we have this is a great asset for ONAP, I think, showing the components, how they relate, and how it's working together. And this release, there is also a cleanup of some components that are no longer part of the ONAP platform. And also we heard from Byung and Chakar about the component modularity and decoupling work that is ongoing in Arcom. That is directly related to the feedback that we got from our users. I mean, the modularity and independence, and that the component interfaces behavior is there is a normalization and standardization on them. They can look very different with different components in ONAP. And you, I guess most of you heard this and had a walkthrough of what the ambitions are in the outcome on this. This is a picture I've used before when we were in Seattle. I want to emphasize that it's not only code that is sort of useful in the ONAP menu. Really welcome sort of testing, documentation, method and process improvements. There's also the elephant fee, of course, that is important so that we can have access to the elephant staff and to help us in this endeavor, and so on. But and this is also a bit changed, but in this essence, the same slide that I used in Seattle. I think we have to sense that there is a sense of urgency. ONAP is challenged, and we have to face the facts. It's getting bashed in the industry, even at the very sort of ONE summit in Seattle, by our peers and to some extent. There are managers in member companies moving people to new assignments, and the people focusing on the next new thing. So maybe Nephew is much nicer now because it's has all its potential still there and hasn't really materialized. So everything is still possible. So only a few companies are actively contributing. It's not likely that we can attract a large number of new contributors. So then you could argue that we can use the code we have. We have a massive code base, and we have a lot of properties. But then the requirements that we get from our users on improvements, that has to be matched with new contributors, and we don't see that much activity. So the suggested actions is to right-size the ambition level, be very clear on what the expectations are, and be opportunistic regarding use cases. Maybe pick sort of popular use cases, and SMO in ORAN being one. And I know we already support that, and many of you work with that. To modularize, as I showed before, in the Arcom is doing. And I think we should create autonomous projects. We should abandon the platform releases and move over to traditional open source. And I know when I talked about this in Seattle, nobody was really happy about that. But I insist. I think we are sort of, we will fail if we hold on to the platform model that we have today. And then we have to have activities that drive collaboration, global requirements, and best practices. And if you bear with me, I'll show some slides where sort of on a sketch of what it could look like. And I think that this is also an important statement. I think an open source community can mature and it can move slower, but it can never afford to be in defense mode. You can't sort of spend your time defending why you don't have this and that requirement, and if you can't fulfill this and that. You have to be, to some extent, master of your own scope and your own expectations. And I mean, you can have a lot of people that want to have things, but it will never work, and you will never get the enthusiasm and the sort of the credit that you deserves if you're in defense mode. Then we had a presentation, I think on Monday, and the consumability of open source projects. So I picked a slide from that, or one slide. What is consumability? So what problem is solved by the project? The project should solve, these are notes from this session, should solve a problem, a clearly identified problem, important not only to us, a shared problem, and people can find and use the artifact of our project. So we have to establish that connection from the people that are consuming the code, consuming the results of ONAP, that they feel that they have that there is a dialogue and it's consumable. So what is consumable in ONAP then? Well, there are individual components once we get them more sort of autonomous, and they can be run by self-organizing teams. I think to a great extent, we have those teams around the different projects that are as a PTL that is elected, but is also an autonomous team. And the teams dictate their own processes and timelines. We don't have to tell exactly how that will had to be done. Centers of excellence are these teams. They should be well known and respected. Have a flexible dialogue with users and continuous development and responsive deliverables. Then you can consume ONAP in the cluster of components guided by use cases. That will bring a greater value than individual components, and it's also useful in marketing. You can show what's the use of this ONAP results, the code we have, and then you can consume ONAP as a platform. But I think if we look at the feedback we get, it's limited to demos, POCs, and field trials. I don't think anyone thinks that we can get to a state where you can seamlessly or upgrade a ONAP platform in production to the next release. And I doubt very much that there is any sort of commercial system that is running the ONAP platform. But please contradict me if you know one. There is no smooth upgrade, and it's attracting a lot of requirements. The scope is way beyond what we can be expected from a normal open source community. I think it's started with a very high ambition that ONAP had in the beginning, and the target was to really get this common platform out that would then be used in many parts of the industry, and we never really got that momentum all through, and it would need an army of designers to bring to an acceptable level. I mean, based on vendor experiences, if I look into my company, what kind of size of resources and so on you need, it's way beyond what we have or can expect. So we need to get more agile and better at managing expectations. Okay, so I wanted to, this is a sketch of a proposed alternative process. I think if we start with the projects that we have today, let's call them components. And I think that they should have continuous development, and we see that today as well. It's continuously evolving and improving and getting better and more useful. It's a dedicated team led by the PTL, and there is then a number of components, and they can be continuously delivered with direct feedback from users. And we have that also now in our release schedule, our release charts, that we allow this sort of constant continuous delivery from the various components. And if we move on, there could be use cases with associated requirements. They should be time limited. They should be the more, let's say, the traditional projects, that there is a start and an end. So you start a use case, you can have sort of course, a use case coming back again and again that we see in ONAP, but that should be then releases to use case stakeholders. So you identify a use case, the use case stakeholders, identifying a use case driver that like we have today, and then to make releases. And then each use case owner is responsible for negotiating the scope with the PTLs of the use components. You can see here that the use case 2, for instance, is using only components from only component A, whereas use case 1 is using component B, and then at various points in time, component D. So and then you have to, as a driver, you have the responsibility then as a use case owner to negotiate, to decide, and to work out the conditions where you get code from the various components. So you would see here, I mean, you could say that the platform is a super use case where you need everything from everyone. But my point here is that this alternative process will give much more agility. It would also make sort of less of planning or less abstraction, the planning, and more direct sort of connection between the use case owners and the components and the PTLs. And then you have to, of course, have global requirements and best practices. I mean, security, different versions of the tools that we're using, and so on. So that should be a continuous improvement led by this subcommittees, is my proposal. And then if you look at this, you would then from time to time put requirements on the components to follow these new security measures or update a certain language and go to new versions of tools. Yeah, that was the end of my presentation. Is there any direct comments on this or proposals?
Yeah. You have time for questions and comments, right?
Yeah. At any time, please.
Yeah, thanks, Magnus. This is Shankar. Especially on the use case side, I think it's been happening similar to what you're proposing, at least the use cases I'm familiar with. Mm-hmm. But I agree, there will be use cases which use only some components. And that does work. I did have a question about, I didn't catch one part. So individual components, of course, they'll have requirements based on what the use case want, and there might be global requirements based on security, language, and things like that. But do you see other requirements feeding into what a component, how it should develop, other than these two factors?
I think there you have to distinguish between what we really would like to have and what is sort of reasonable that we can achieve. And I think that looking at other open source initiatives, you would have much less of conformity, and you would have sort of a common thread maybe on the different the different components of different teams. I mean, the more that you can talk and decide and be have a common solution, that's of course better. But in my proposal here in the model, with that the use case owners have a big role here in sort of putting requirements, so that when the use case doesn't want to have different flavors or different interfaces and APIs and so on from different components, it should express those requirements towards the PTLs and influence these components. And then you can say that then the use cases will have a different set of components that they work with, and it will be sort of a bit heterogeneous then, as opposed to a platform. But I think it is already now, I mean, quite heterogeneous in how the different components are made and are functioning in the platform.
So there won't be any more some kind of integration test to ensure that components are able to work with each other?
No, we will put that on the use case owners, or in the case where you use only if I go up to this, if you have continuous delivery, then you would have a dialogue between the users of this component that will then put requirements on some conformity of the components, because they are integrating them in their systems, and they would like to have them look the same. So the conformance here would come from the users of the components and from the requirements from the use case owners. And that puts more emphasis on use case owners being sort of project managers or technical leaders of their use case, and not being able to rely on the platform anymore, because there is no platform. And again, you have to distinguish between what you wish for and what is reasonable to expect.
Magnus, one comment, observation.
Mm-hmm.
So from my perspective, ONAP was great. Many company showed their interest at the beginning because company wants to learn the network automation.
Mm-hmm.
So AT&T, the Unix, Linux, they combine and provide ONAP. So the company, they need to learn how it's working, and then so they saw a lot of functionalities. So it was great. So 5 years later, they learn how it's going, but now they are in the phase how to use ONAP. So I saw many cases in the company, they like to use ONAP, but currently ONAP is the coupling, and the platform is very coupling with the function, and then use case is very coupled. So one case they want to use certain component because they already have other component in their own portfolio. So
Right.
they don't usually take ONAP as a whole platform, because otherwise they have to give up their own character. So they want to pick and choose which component they want to use, even though not just the component level, sub-component level, because for example, SO, some company has already the service orchestration function, but they want to pick a particular network service like NFVO. They want to do that. They don't want to take whole SO overriding their own company's service orchestrator component. So for that, from that perspective, ONAP doesn't have a good flexibility. So it's, you know, it's moving like as a whole chunk, monolithic. Even though they have a component, it's the moving like, you know, component. So I saw the one telephone company, they want to use a particular the service orchestrator, but the service orchestrator component is so tightly coupled between workflow and then code. When they update for following their use cases, and they have to change their core code. That means their core code is different from the ONAP, the mainstream. So ONAP going next release, and then the company have to catch up because they have to bring up to another one. They have to customize it. So that's why not just the project level, component level or sub-component. That's why architecture committee is following this idea concept. We try to modularize and not just a project level sub-component, and also the release per component could be different and more dynamic. So that's why we try to get some idea from Kubernetes, like Nephew, some of the how they handling the component interface, the component function. They try to do more decorative definition, decorative API. So API is the ONAP. We provide some API specification, one component talking to this component using this API. We define that. The problem is, for example, ANI is very core inventory function in the ONAP. But some company already have their own inventory system, but they want to use their own inventory system, but they want to take some function of the ONAP the component. The problem is the component heavily coupled with the ANI, so that's why they couldn't use it unless it really significantly changes. So that's why one of the study item is component modularity is important, the building perspective and the CI and CD perspective, but the component, not just interface behavior. So when company wants to replace some of the, like for example, inventory, they're using inventory but take the owner component, it should work together and without real friction. So one good example in ONAP SE alignment, we are following the standard the specification from ATT communication. Then for example, ONAP SO, they can support multiple NFVO on SO, NFVO in the China Mobile VFC, or some vendor specific, for example, Verizon NFVO. The reason they can pick and choose which the network service function, because of the interface and behavior standards. So those things we have to promote. So not just carrying whole platform as is, we need to more flexible and then more decorative, more independent and more agile. Otherwise, the company, they know how network automations work now by this time. But to apply the ONAP, they have to find this easy to use and then make sense to use, not just we have to take ONAP as a whole platform. That's too much for them to adopt ONAP into. That's my observation. And then that's why I like this the proposed and then this mainstream is very valuable, because this to me is a good direction to revive the ONAP interest by the community. That's all.
Yep. Thanks, Byung. Thanks for sharing your experiences there. I think that this model where you can sort of utilize the different components it's very valuable, and that's the standard model for many that are using ONAP. And then I think it would be valuable if you can come to this, that you can ask users to come out and show use cases and be involved in the process and be more directly involved in development in ONAP, not just sitting at the side or utilizing, but also drive some use cases. And we are thankful for the people that do that now, but I think that role would have then to increase. So hopefully, if you have you have a use case in a company, and you would be encouraged then to bring that use case and to drive some of your work that you have to do anyway, not internally in your company, but actually externally, and working in ONAP with that, and then use different components. Any more feedback? Ideas? Any feedback from developers on what you think is useful here or not useful?
So Magnus, so it looks like to me then the onus is being placed on the use case owner to confirm the use case functionality after the components are released, since there's no test of the use case within the release process as there is now. So the changes are a little bit speculative, right? So
Right.
the use case owner says, you know, these are the changes that I need. So the component owners make those changes, the component gets released, the use case owner, you know, collects the components that they need, puts them together, then sees if it works, right? And then
Right. Yeah.
and then they
Yeah.
go, oh wait, we thought these changes would support this use case, but actually they don't.
Mm-hmm.
You know, our speculation was incorrect here. So
Right.
then what? Then they put in more changes to the, or request more changes to the components, or they make the changes themselves and feed them back, or how does that work?
No, I tried to depict this in some way that you see in timeline here, that you would get the component B here to use case 1 rather early in your use case sort of project, and you will be able to test that and see, and then you give feedback and saying, like you said, no, this is not what we expected, this is not working that well. So you would have a dialogue all through, and you would have to have a process that you put up for the use cases where you either trust that the components are doing exactly like you wanted it to do, or if you don't, you have to get early samples of it, or you have to have POCs coming in, and you can then feed back your experience or your expectations. So in this case, you wouldn't have help from a platform, but you would run sort of each use case as a type of platform. And the idea here is that you can't rely on someone else to do this, and you have to put up the communication with the PTLs and get a way of trusting each other to deliver what's needed.
Yeah, I think the current process is, or the current integration approach is probably you know, a process that was developed in a time when all of the components were in an immature state, and we needed to, you know, comprehensively test the use cases. That, you know, the standard integration tests for each release. But now, like, they were in like ONAP's pretty mature. The amount of API changes and the amount of component changes on the existing capabilities is quite small. And we have some tests there that already test those. And actually, in cases where those existing use cases are changing, for example, in the move to Streamlined Kafka, we actually have we actually have like the current approach, isn't really helping us with that, because some of the projects involved are without PTLs, or they're at various levels of maintenance. Having integration tests at all is debatable, the value of it now. Whereas here, if the use cases are driven by the use case owners and the work is driven by the use case owners, then the use case owners, have skin in the game, if you like. They're motivated to make sure that the components either do what they're doing, or they'll know that the components won't do what they're doing.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think it's a much more kind of let's say organic way of approaching ONAP at this point than than what we had up to now. Yeah, what we had maybe up to the last two releases ago, has served us well. But I think it is time to have some introspection now and see what's best for ONAP from now on.
Yeah, you're right. It's a decentralization of responsibilities that you do here, and you can then also make it quite sort of. You can make sure that people understand that there is not a big a pool of resources that's going to take your requirements and do something. You have to work with the people that are there. You have to involve yourself also in the nitty-gritties of getting this to work.
And Dan does some onus on the components to ensure that backward compatibility is maintained. So I mean, if, for example, in the policy framework case, to make sure that our APIs don't change, even if details might change behind them, but we should preserve backward compatibility. And if not, there's a kind of responsibility to advertise that,
and
then work with the people that might.
Yeah, and of course you have to feel a responsibility as a PTL that you don't let the sort of the deliverables to the different use cases be different. You should actually send exactly the same code to all the use cases and not sort of forking or doing special cases and so on. So you have to orchestrate that in some way that you serve the different use cases, and that's also the case for this external stakeholders that you have here.
And in fact, in policy anyway, and I don't know about other projects, but we've been sort of internally doing a rolling, more agile approach to development for 2 or 3 releases now. I mean, we've been doing interim releases, not planned on dates, but whenever we have a block of functionality that needs to go in, and we've been releasing those. We've even done those on. We've even done interim releases on, say, Honolulu and Istanbul for when some of our users needed security fixes to go in. I mean, that was remarkably, smooth, and thanks to all the companies that were involved in that. So, I mean, this is sort of a process that works rather well.
Well, I think
terms.
that's a great point. And that's something I try to emphasize to people, because a common criticism of the process is that it's waterfall. Well, the thing is that the release that I work on, or that we all work on, that we do twice a year, you can really think of that as kind of a meta release, or a release of releases. And true, it's waterfallish, but the individual component releases that make up that release of releases, that meta release, they can be anything that we want them to be. So if teams want to operate in an agile fashion and do continuous releases at that level, that's perfectly fine. So the agile nature of the components, that's not precluded by the release that we do you know, at the ONAP level.
Yeah, but I think probably the waterfall aspect of it isn't so much the actual packaging at the end that say RC or whatever, David. It's more the earlier milestones are the ones that I'd question, because they you know, you know, on ONAP we can say, well, whatever we have, I don't know what's our RC date for London, sometime probably May or June. I
June,
guess.
yeah, June,
Early
1.
June, yeah.
June
Yeah.
1.
So I mean, we could say, well, okay, projects. What do you have ready at that time? We'll take whatever you have.
Mhm.
We'll take your latest stable release. That's it, and and then we you know, forget about all the earlier stuff. Yeah, just
Right.
being blasé about it.
I think there's a question from Bob about the CI/CD
Okay,
hygiene.
I didn't see that. Please go ahead.
Bob,
Yeah, hi,
do you have
Magnus.
can you elaborate?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so I definitely thinking about the new proposed process and how like a security subcommittee or security management or just even supporting security hygiene for as part of a continuous integration, continuous delivery mode. And just trying to think, has there been any thought about if that would change, how that would change, how would we support in this new sort of process? I mean, we have a current set of tooling that's supporting the projects now with the automated scanning. And I see that sort of supporting this process in general. But I think when we start talking about like the integration, I guess, in use cases, I'm just trying to imagine sort of how we could support the security of those. And I just started thinking about it as you're presenting this, and I didn't know if there was any discussions amongst the TSC or discussions that you had when you're coming up with this proposal.
Oh,
Well, I guess sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that this proposal is very much an initiative that I've tried to drive. I don't think we've had a debate yet in the TSC about this. I presented some parts of this in Seattle, but we didn't have a big discussion. And I welcome every sort of aspect of this. Sort of what it means to, for instance, the security aspects. Or I was sort of very rough thinking that it wouldn't change that much because you would have this global requirements, best practices would have to come in at the same point in the components. It's difficult to see that you would sort of demand to have them at different points in time. But that's just a first thought.
Yeah, and some of the things that you were talking about in terms of some cultural shifts in terms of working, having sort of requirement proposers work, being responsible for working directly with the PTLs. I guess in this case would be the use case owners. And it's sort of a negotiation. This is what we'd like. What can you do, PTL? What can you fit in your current sort of sprint? However, they're going to be managing their releases in this new process. And generally, the things that you're discussing aren't things that the SecCom has already been doing. So I could kind of see actually that sort of just translating over pretty easily, because there's a number of things where we're just, when we're proposing things, these non-functional requirements, it's always, okay, let's go talk to the PTL, see how they feel about this. Okay, maybe we need to adapt some things. So I could see the activities that SecCom does sort of fitting within this proposed process. At least that's my perspective on that.
Yeah, and I'm happy to hear that. that's one of the main thing here is that you have to couple the sort of the requirements to some kind of achievements. That's at least my thinking here. If you just put requirements sort of into the components or the platform in general, and you don't do anything, then you're just sort of making things worse. You may think that you're kind because you tell people what they should do, but I think in this is more balanced. This is sort of, if you go in as a use case owner or a use case stakeholder, you take more responsibility for being part of the process and part of the requirements. Breaking down the requirements and know what you get, and then you would be more in sort of part of a priority process, or you can see here that everything can't be done at the same time. So you would also connect of course the requirements process much more to the actual design here. I'm not saying that this is not happening now, and that I know people are doing that, but it would be more visible.
Just on the point of the security, I mean, the scans and all that are, I guess they're automatic today, and there's no reason why that would change.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I say that would be. I didn't say global requirements, like say, if in M we decided to go to Java 17, for example, that would probably be best practices, and then in the new daily release, it could be a global requirement again. That's just something that the components pick up, and then we just check at the release bundling time that it's done.
Couple of comments. I agree with Liam's. And Bobby has a good question. This is really excellent question. So I think to me, CI/CD is for automation. So we just need some kind of a pipeline, the CI/CD pipeline tool as needed. Liam says scanning tool, and probably we have some additional CI/CD security-related hygiene tool. And that's the first couple. We need to explore that, so it's good to discuss. But second is, even though we do support component modularity and autonomous way, but I still value some security and logging common component platform level services, because we try to handle most of the security and the logging out of the application. So component can, without worrying too much about those areas, they can focus on their function, what they deliver, what function they're gonna deliver, and the security we are still handling at the platform. So the reason that we try to pursue this, the security and logging should be uniform way and standard way as possible, because ONAP is just reference platform, and many many operators, they want to communicate the ONAP component. For example, there are several the vendor-specific components in the Etsy. They have VNFM and they have their own NFO. We had a great difficulty to integrate with the component with the ONAP securely, because of the ONAP using ONAP-specific security mechanism, which is AAF. That's why the OEM team, they strive so much to get rid of AAF and then providing more standard open source way of the security mechanism, which can be used industry-wide. That's why some other third-party the operator component work together with the ONAP component securely. We have some foundation. So anyway, back to CI/CD, we need the security hygiene. We need to study for that. Tool we need to study further, and not just the security, the vulnerability checking, and the process-wise it should be secure, because we more automated the process. So. And also, we are also security platform as uniform to cover the actual runtime, the security.
Yeah, I think you're right in that keeping it up that automated process is important. I don't think I see a change in that. One aspect that I've said before, but is that have a clear responsibility. I was thinking that in this, for the global requirements best practices, you would have a clear owner in the subcommittees. Maybe we have to have more subcommittees, or we have to have some kind of best practices subcommittee that is working with these aspects. And but as long as there is a clear understanding among everyone who's the requirement owner and how they work together with the components, it's okay. Are there? Yes.
This is
please.
Maggie.
Yes.
I think it's good just to keep in mind that the telecommunication landscape is shifting into a more, I see more traditional network architecture.
Mm-hmm.
So there may be people using ONAP that are not telecom operators necessarily per se. So I think that's something good to keep in mind, and something good to just think about the underlying aspects of the telecommunication architecture and that shift that it is going through with the introduction of Kubernetes and cloud, and trying to make sure that ONAP can be integrated into that architecture in an automated fashion.
Yeah, I think you're perfectly right. I mean, we see that transformation going on, and we have adapted to that in ONAP with the working with CNF and adapting, and we have to keep doing that. And in that respect, you're right. I mean, it gives an opportunity to use ONAP outside of the telecom world, but it also calls for some kind of you have to a wide eye. You have to look in
It's
both
not easy.
directions. No.
Yeah.
Yesterday, the Wim from Nokia at the nephew presentation, he said telecom is not special. So
Right.
whatever industry just best practice or best way tool we're using, so it's okay to use it.
Yeah. Now someone said that the mobile network is just a branch of internet. So it's just an access form, but maybe that's driving it too hard, but too far. I think if we're at the top of the hour, next after the break, we will attempt to go through the table that David has prepared for the various parts of the release process. This is an experiment, but I would like to that we try to go through the points as far as we can and look at sorry, what we can improve these that we've done in the PTL meetings 2 times, and also have sort of look at, is there any difference when it comes to this alternative process for it's a traditional, and we might sort of keep the traditional process, and then we have some improvement work to do there in the release process as well. But it could be interesting to see if we can see some differences here. So I guess I will stop the recording